Hello, and welcome to Inside Vox, our in-depth interview series with distinguished guests. Today I'm joined by Mike Billington from LarouchePAC. Mike is also Asia editor for Executive Intelligence Review. Welcome to the program, Mike. This is the first of a series of interviews covering economic issues, and today we're going to focus on what constitutes a credit system. Mike, most people in Britain are completely unaware of what a credit system is. In fact, most of us have been brought up thinking only in terms of money and monetary systems. So how do we explain a credit system under these circumstances, and what is the role of money in a credit system?
Well, what I'd like to do first is to actually establish the discovery of economic science, not just economics, but the science of economics by Gottfried Friedrich Leibniz. And I think that's extremely important because Leibniz thinking was the source for the founding of the American Republic and the creation of the creditary system, which the original American system was, as opposed to a monetary system. Leibniz, who was by far the greatest philosopher, statesman, a scientist, and the founder of the economic science, basically identified the fact that something you might call the machine tool principle is the essence of the economic progress of mankind as a whole. In other words, the idea that it's the creative individual human mind who discovers a new principle of the universe or an application of a new principle discovered of the universe and applies that to the creation of machine tools which uplift the population of the entire nation, or in fact the entire world, because such a discovery, once made and once implemented, can be used internationally. And we've seen that throughout history. There are many, many examples, obviously. A simple one is the fact that the discovery of the nature of the atomic structure of matter, the equivalence of energy and matter, by many people, especially Einstein's discoveries about the nature of matter and energy, the equivalence of nature and energy, made it possible to develop nuclear power plants, which completely transformed the capacity of man's ability to generate energy flux density increases at a level far beyond anything that had existed before. And similarly with the development of fusion power, which should be online already, but is at least in process and should be on soon. So this was the nature of that discovery, as opposed to the so-called British system, as Adam Smith, for instance, understood it, which located economics purely as a matter of buying cheap and selling dear, money. How do you increase your money flow, your money intake? How do you make money? That is not economics. That is something that takes place within an economic system. But economics is the science of human progress. It's the most advanced science. It's not mathematics. It's not formulas. It's the scientific nature of scientific discovery and the application of those discoveries to the advancement of humanity as a whole. So look, for instance, at what Adam Smith actually said about what economics is. And I'm sure you've heard this before, Mike, but I'm going to read you a passage from Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, which I think captures the nature of the difference between monetarism and a creditary system. He says, quote, "Nature has directed us to follow the original and immediate instincts, hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the two sexes, the love of pleasure and the dread of pain, prompt us to apply those means for their own sake, and without any consideration of their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce by them." Now, think of that. This is the idea of the nature of man, which completely leaves out the human mind. There's no creativity involved. There's no thinking. There's no human mind. It's only animal instincts. This is the invisible hand of Adam Smith, right? The core of his economic ideas, so-called.
And this has been expressed in modern times through so-called behavioral economics.
Yes, exactly. Sure. People are animals. The concept here is that man is an animal who has exactly the same nature of physical passions and instincts, leaving out the question of the human mind, which is exactly what Leibniz very clearly identified as the nature of humanity, what Leibniz called the monadology, the idea that the human creative mind reflects the creativity of the universe as a whole, that the process of development of the universe is concentrated in the human species and no other, in the creative powers of the human mind, which every single individual has. This is quite distinct from the idea of organizing society around the concept of man as an animal. And now, think about that in terms of politics. Clearly, to have an empire, to wish to have a control over the world in terms of master and slave, empires require the concept of man, which says that in order to be a ruler, you have to be able to crush the weak. You have to be able to treat certain human beings as slaves as opposed to masters. And you therefore need a concept of man that underlies economics, which basically treats human beings as animals. So this is really the essence of how to understand what came about in the discovery of the American system by Alexander Hamilton. What the founding, and Leibniz was the primary influence on Cotton Mather, on Benjamin Franklin, on Alexander Hamilton. It was these ideas that gave rise to the American Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, the idea of the general welfare being the responsibility of the state, the idea of the pursuit of happiness, which does not mean Adam Smith's sexual passions. The happiness came directly from Leibniz. The idea that true joy in life comes from the capacity to utilize and develop the creative powers of your mind and participate in the advancement of society as a whole, of the world as a whole. This was what Schiller meant by his Ode to Joy, the An die Freude, which Beethoven set famously to the Ninth Symphony. These are the concepts which were the bedrock of the American system. And of course, I don't need to say, long since forgotten in the United States, as well as elsewhere in the West. But this was the nature of the founding by Alexander Hamilton of the creditary system, which is known as the American system of economics.
Now, one of the major difficulties people seem to have is over the role of Alexander Hamilton. He's perceived by many as being a banker's man, of bringing central banking to the newly created United States. And it has always seemed to me that what he created was something somewhat different to that, a national bank operating in the interests of the nation. So how should we view Hamilton, and how do we differentiate his national bank from, say, the Bank of England?
Yeah, right. It's exactly the opposite. The Anglophile misrepresentation of Hamilton is that he somehow was a banker's man from London. What he created with the National Bank was a complete, utter refutation of the central banking system in London and in most of the European countries at that time. What he created through a national bank, owned and run by the government, not by private bankers, as central banks are. The central banking system is, in fact, banking control over the government's economic policies. The National Bank was precisely aimed at reversing that, giving the power over the governing of the economy to elected officials in the government and directing credit to those things necessary for the general welfare. And I think it's important to understand why the National Bank functioned the way it did. Its fundamental purpose originally was to deal with the fact that the states were bankrupt after the Revolutionary War. The banking institutions that existed at the time were effectively bankrupt. Funding that war, the Revolutionary War, left people with huge debts, mostly to the British. So what Hamilton did, and it was the key to uniting the nation and pulling the disparate states into a common nation, was that he absorbed the debts from the states into the new national bank and effectively turned debt into credit. By basically absorbing those debts, it freed the states to use access to credit for development. So the idea was we will repay these debts, including to the British, whom we just defeated in a war, but we will pay them through production. We will not pay them through austerity. We will not do what's being done in the United States and Europe today, which is dealing with the debt crisis by printing huge quantities of money to bail out the banks and imposing massive austerity policies on the economy, on industry, on people, slashing of budgets, slashing of employment, slashing of pensions. This idea was unacceptable. The idea was absorb those debts into the national bank, issue new credits with the idea that being freed of those debts on a local basis and getting new credits extended into the local situation, into the local banking system, you would create production which would be able to, in the long term, pay off the indebtedness and make the credit sound. Now, the key to that was how do you extend that credit? And that's where the idea of directing credit came from, which was Hamilton's fundamental discovery. The point is that by having a national bank owned by the government, you don't just throw money into the economy. This is Keynes, by the way, and we can come back to that. People sometimes think that a national bank means a Keynesian system of just pumping money into the economy. It's not just pumping money into the economy, it's directing money into those things necessary for the general welfare, which means internal improvements, what they called internal improvements then, infrastructure basically, in roads, in power, in water projects, in canal building, in building the hospitals and schools necessary to have a skilled and healthy workforce for your economy. These were directed in the sense that these extensions of credit from the national bank had strings attached. You couldn't just use this money to build racetracks and whorehouses. You built them, you had to use it for specified means of investment. I'll mention briefly here, we can go back to it later, but Roosevelt, who did not revive the national banking system, but used the fact that we were in a horrible depression and then in a world war to basically say we have to take emergency measures, and those measures were effectively the Hamiltonian creditary policies. That credit was issued into the economy during the Depression, which built the most incredible explosion of infrastructure development, water projects, nuclear power plants were then beginning to be worked on soon after the war. Transportation networks basically got out of the Depression by massive construction and building an economy, which then, when the war came, was transformed through retooling of basic industry into creating the war machine, which otherwise we would have lost. It was the logistics, the productive power of the United States that made it possible to defeat the Nazis and the Japanese militarists. So that system, that idea of an American system, national bank is central to it, but there's other ways that it can be done than national banking, as was shown by Roosevelt. Today, we need to restore a national bank. We need to do exactly the opposite of what has been done, especially under the last 16 years of Bush and Obama, which was dealing with financial crises by pumping huge amounts of money into bailing out gambling debts in the banking system, having done away with the Glass-Steagall Act, which we can also discuss. But to do the opposite in the sense that you direct that credit. And this is the difference between a creditary system and a monetary system. Money is stupid. Money doesn't know anything. Money is just used for whatever anybody wants to use it for. Credit has a future. Credit is the idea that you're issuing these credits, which involved using money, but it's the creditary idea that says, here's where we want to be 50 years from now. In order to do that, what's our bill of materials? What do we need in terms of raw materials, of steel, of energy, of water, of clean water, of educated and healthy citizens? What we need in order to create a world that looks like this 50 years from now means that we have to invest into those productive powers and into scientific research and development in order to attain those things that we need in the future. So the credit has a mind. It has a mind in the sense that it sees the future and it creates the kind of economy needed in order to achieve that result.
Okay, so what was the historical background to Hamilton's thinking? You've mentioned Leibniz, but speak from a practical point of view. Did it begin? Is the first example of it that we know of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or are there other examples?
But you're right on that. I'm not sure I can speak in detail about the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but a whole series of things took place where people in the colonies began to recognize that they were being kept backwards by a British policy that said the colonies should remain agricultural. We want to utilize the agricultural goods exported to England and to our other colonies where our soldiers are and so forth. And built up a whole network of people who believed that. Even after the founding of the Republic, there was an intense fight between Hamilton and Jefferson, Jefferson, a slave owner, who wanted to keep the country agricultural, who was opposed to Hamilton's ideas of industrialization and building major infrastructure. This was the battle that continued right through to the Civil War, and it wasn't until the Civil War that issue was fought out and won by the American system against the British system that fostered the South and fostered thinkers like Jefferson. Now, of course, Jefferson was part of the revolution against the British, but the way they worked is that the Tory factions within the United States continued to advocate against the ideas of Cotton Mather, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and against the idea of making the U.S. independent economically, meaning productively. And that was the root of the policies that Hamilton brought to bear through his work, through the writing of the Federalist Papers, which you probably read some of, which he did with Jay and others, which built a nation amongst the population. The Federalist Papers were issued during the process of having won the revolution and then creating the Constitution in order to involve virtually every citizen in the country in the debates over how to establish a republic, how to make it function. And remember Ben Franklin's famous phrase when he came out of the Constitutional Convention and somebody asked him, "So what is it going to be, Mr. Franklin?" And he said, "It's a republic if you can keep it." Because it's not easy. It's not easy to do. You actually have to base your nation on the creative power of your citizenry. And the idea behind this was, again, there's economics, there's structures, national banking, but you can't let yourself think that these are formulas or structures which you simply impose the structure. The fundamental concept is the nature of a man. How does your nation and how does your government treat the concept of a human being as opposed to an animal? If you have that as your basic thinking, then you can succeed in building a republic. And in our world today, you can succeed in building a world based on the New Silk Road, on the idea of bringing Russia and China and the United States and the nations of Europe and the nations in the third world together around the idea of development and the enhancement of the dignity of man, as opposed to the basically Hobbesian idea of dog eat dog, master and slave, social Darwinism, which of course is the champion of the British system or the British form of colonial power, was this idea of social Darwinism, that man is just an animal and that you have to treat him like an animal. So those are the fundamental concepts that underlie economics as the highest science of man.
Hamilton, as we've mentioned already, viewed the debts that were accrued through fighting the War of Independence as an obligation because they were taken in good faith. And I don't really see how anyone can argue with that. But my understanding is that his intention was that once the debt was paid, that would be the last debt taken on by the federal government. His intention was to use the power implied by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution to create treasury bills on the credit of the nation, which were then to be turned into money for use in the economy. And that would therefore become a sovereign act and not subject, as we've sort of mentioned, to the whims of private banking interests. What has become of this process, and how did the US get to the point that it's abandoned its credit system, or at least it seems to have, and jumped back on board monetarism?
I don't think it's accurate to say that he did not want the government to have debts. Um, in issuing treasury bills, you're accruing debt. The point is that what is the direction that that debt is taking? If you're taking on debt for the purpose of enhancing the productivity of the nation through the various necessary means of science, technology, infrastructure, health, um, and the basic needs of the people, then that debt is not inflationary. Um, he was not opposed to debt. It was the question of using that debt only within the creditary idea of directing that credit into the needs of the general welfare. What happened to that system didn't happen only after 100 years or something. The National Bank was created, it was then torn apart. A second national bank was created, that was torn apart. You had very few American presidents who actually fought for the idea of the creditary system. John Quincy Adams was on. As I already indicated, Jefferson was not an advocate of this system. The Adams family was questionable on this. But the National Bank had been established, it functioned. I don't have in my mind how and when exactly it got taken down. Andrew Jackson and Van Buren, that group of presidents, were total Anglophiles, absolutely opposed to the National Bank. You probably know that Andrew Jackson is held up, and unfortunately also by Donald Trump, who doesn't understand the Jackson phenomenon, unfortunately. But he's held up as some sort of a Democrat against the big banks. Quite the opposite. He was opposed to any kind of central banking direction in order to facilitate the private bankers that he represented, like Van Buren and the British, and brought down the national bank and set in motion the process which led inevitably to the Civil War. The question of how to sustain that republic, the question that Ben Franklin addressed, has been the fight in the United States throughout that period of time. I would say, just in brief, that when you had Abraham Lincoln come in, recognizing that the nation had been torn apart by the British, he not only organized the Russians to come in and help defend the North against a threat of British invasion joining the South. The Russians put their fleet in New York Harbor and in San Francisco Harbor and warned the British that they would be a war with them if they tried to join in the Civil War in the U.S. But what Lincoln did was that he issued greenbacks, which was this is another example of how you can have American system banking without necessarily having the national bank. He issued greenbacks. This was very controversial. And you could say, well, if you're issuing greenbacks, you're going to create massive inflation. But this was government-controlled greenbacks. It's another form of what you were indicating was, issuing bonds in the name of the government. It was basically issuing money, but with very, very strong strings attached in order to build up the economic and social structure needed to defend the Republic against the Confederacy and its British backers. So that brought the American system back. We had continued fights with mostly bad presidents after Lincoln, leading up to the abomination of Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, a total imperial-minded person, leading ultimately towards the breakdowns that we had in the early part of the 20th century and to what really was a century of war. The entire 20th century was a disaster. When McKinley was killed, he was the last of the American system advocates. And you had the Teddy Roosevelt, imperial-minded economic, British system economics take over, which led eventually to the Great Depression, to the First World War, the Second World War, the Great Depression. And it wasn't really till Roosevelt implemented what I mentioned a few minutes ago, using the crisis of the Depression and the war to implement directed credit, to return to a creditary policy. That's how that fell apart.
We've said this already, but there's a huge difference between what Hamilton did and what we're in terms of the debt for the war, the War of Independence, and what we're told our obligations are today. The debt we're under today is completely different style, but most importantly, his motivation was to use the national bank to increase productivity of the nation. And as we've said already, there was no mention of austerity. So I'm interested to get some kind of definition of what productivity means in this context.
Well, it's not money. You can't measure productivity in money. How do you measure progress in an economy? Lyndon LaRouche has developed a concept he calls the potential relative population density. And that's sort of a mouthful. But he developed it from Leibniz as the first true economic scientist. And the concept is that in order to measure progress in an economy, you have to really put all money valuations aside. And you look at the throughput of scientific ideas into productive capacity. Measuring at most, you measure productive output of certain goods, of quantities of steel. As I mentioned before, you think about what you need in a future time if we're going to colonize space, if we're going to have a global high-speed maglev rail system connecting all of the continents except maybe Australia. Maybe even Australia can be connected. But to do that, you're going to need so much steel. You're going to need so much machine tool capacity. You're going to need so much water. You're going to need so many skilled workforce people. You're going to need, and so forth. You work out a bill of materials that you're going to need in order to achieve a certain result. Think about that in terms of what Adam Smith had to say, where he said, explicitly, you should follow your passions with no thought, for their own sake, with no thought about the result. It's quite the opposite. You have to start with the future. And it's the result of what you're going to do that determines what you're going to do. And that's the only basis on which an economy can function productively. And this has been true not only in the United States, it's been true throughout history. Every period of progress has always been based on a humanist concept of man, which gave rise to a Renaissance, which allowed science to prosper, and for that science to be carried out to the population and then applied in ways that lift the platform. It's the idea of lifting the platform upon which the human race exists, lifting the productive powers of labor through education, science, health, and so forth, and the capacity of that skilled and healthy population to produce by enhanced machine tool capacity, which comes from constantly increasing the scientific input to the what you might call the Mittelstand, what the Germans call the Mittelstand, which is these small enterprises which take new scientific concepts that are being discovered and designs the necessary machine tools to take advantage of that enhanced knowledge about the physical universe, which can then be utilized in industry and production and construction and so forth. That's the basis upon which you direct not just the money, right? But you actually direct your organization of society in such a way as to create a necessary output. And as you know from Lyndon LaRouche's constant refrain on this, the way you start today is you have to start in the stars. You have to start at the level of at least the solar system in order to think back to how we achieve the idea that man is not an earthling, that as Kraft Erika, the great German space scientist who came and developed some of our fundamental rockets and key concept, he had an idea of the extraterrestrial imperative, that's what characterizes man, is that the idea of man is that we are not earthlings. He once said that if God had wanted us to go to space, he would have given us a moon, which is a good concept. But this is really the essence of the idea of a credit system as opposed to a money system.
It's interesting you mention machine tools, and of course, you're singling out the British system and Britain as being the opposing sort of ideology compared to the American systems. Possibly not the right word, but when we look at what the British government has done over the last 50, 60 years, certainly post Second World War, when we look at the development of aircraft technologies, uh, military aircraft technology, but civilian as well, and British government systematically scrapping those technologies, those production lines, and not only stopping the production, but actually scrapping the machine tools and scrapping the jigs, destroying every remnant of the technology that was involved. This is something which is uh, seems to be endemic within the British government, the British establishment thinking.
Well, I don't want to. I don't want to get into sort of a clinical discussion of the British economy over the last 50 years.
No, no,
Um,
I'm purely thinking in terms of the mentality that does that kind of
yeah,
thing.
but we have that same problem in the U.S. That's my point. That this is not the British; it's the British system, which is the problem. And we have the problem of the British system in the United States just as emphatically as you do there in the UK. Look, this entire green phenomenon, which again, as you know, this anti-science, anti-nuclear, anti-development, anti-human mentality has its birth in, again, the British system. The Prince Philip was the founder of the World Wildlife Fund. He and Prince Bernard from Holland, the Anglo-Dutch Empire, which fostered the idea. It really was the pre-war idea of eugenics, of race science. These are the people who believe that the problems in the world are that we're overcrowded, there's too many people, and of course, this is the entire green movement today, which says that it's the pollution of our Earth which is going to destroy our future. Well, this, of course, pollution is real, but the idea that somehow industry is causing that problem because of carbon is absolutely absurd. It's a scientific fraud. It's not pollution. Carbon is not a pollution. It's food for plants. And the idea that in any way human capacity has created increased carbon and therefore global warming and all of that is a concept which goes back to the anti-human concept before World War II, known as eugenics, and that was discredited when the German Nazis picked up that eugenics movement from the British and the Americans, from Teddy Roosevelt, among others, and implemented it in a way which made clear to the human race that this was a genocidal concept, an anti-human concept. So after the war, this idea of so-called conservationism and then later environmentalism was picked up by the people who fostered eugenics. It was just another excuse for saying we cannot all progress. We have to have a reason to tell the third world and even our own people that we can't have progress because it's going to end up destroying the environment. Man pollutes. We have to tell the third world that for them to aspire to having the standard of living that exists in the advanced sector would unfortunately cause the world to burn up. Obama said this literally. This is practically a quote when Obama was speaking to grad students in South Africa. Imagine, scientific graduate students. Obama said, if you aspire to having 2 cars and air conditioning, the world will burn up. I mean, this is as British imperialism as you can get. So this is not a problem that only exists in the UK. It's a problem that exists throughout the world, and emphatically here in the United States. The last 2 governments we had were British system advocates, the Bush and Obama administrations. And that idea of restricting economics to money, having a science based upon a fraudulent idea of science. I should mention, let me go back. I don't think this is a diversion. When we discussed Leibniz as opposed to the Adam Smith school, Leibniz was also at war with Sir Isaac Newton. And I think to understand the economics, you have to understand the scientific fight that was going on at that time. Leibniz, in his correspondence with Clarke, who was speaking for Newton, absolutely rejected Newton's fraud that the world was a great big box in which things are bouncing around, a fixed space and fixed time concept. Leibniz destroyed that by simply holding up reality to that and made it clear that concepts like Newton's of gravity, where he imagined that two bodies have some magical pull on each other, that this is something that exists at a distance with nothing else affecting it. It's just magic. Well, this is absurd. And Leibniz understood that the universe was a dynamic process. It was not a fixed box in which fixed things. Everything is in motion. The force fields created by motion, even Kepler, who actually discovered gravity, not Newton, he discovered it because he understood that the orbits of the planets were pre-existing before the planets themselves formed, that they were created by the force fields generated by what Kepler believed to be the motion of the sun. What his conception of how that force field came about was not completely accurate, but it was the right intention, the right idea. And this was bastardized by Newton into a formula, a mathematics, right? A money versus credit concept applied to science. And it's not a surprise that when Keynes opened up the chest of Sir Isaac Newton, to his horror, he discovered that Newton was a mystic, believed in magic. He spent most of his time on pursuing magical ideas. And Keynes closed the trunk and said, never open this thing again. Well, that's the point, is that scientifically these ideas are fraudulent. They don't represent the real world. The real world is dynamic. An economy, especially, is dynamic. It's not something that fits according to a formula, like the Black-Scholes formula that was being used by the derivative speculators that led to the breakdown, several breakdowns, actually. These mathematical formulas don't represent the physical economy, which is a dynamic process. And the idea that LaRouche had of the potential relative population density was based on measuring the way in which you can have an expanding population at a higher standard of living as the potential for how you determine your investment decisions and creditary decisions at any moment in time. It's defined by the future. You have to be able, as only mankind can do, no animal can do, to actually know the future, to see the future and act from the future back on the present.
Well, Mike, thank you very much for that. We're going to have to leave it there for today. We're going to follow up on this. I think this is a good point to stop it. Thank you very much for joining us, Mike Billington from LarouchePAC and Executive Intelligence Review.